Dr. Ian Hickie, welcome to the podcast. Thanks a million for coming on.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jim.
You're sporting a lovely tan.
Yes. On this side of the world, I've just crawled back into my office after the long summer break. And of course, we in Australia are rather fortunate at the moment that our COVID world's a little easier to live in than many others.
You got to do a little bit of local traveling, I guess, in the region.
I'm very fortunate that I have a beach house up the coast from Sydney, and you can disappear into the surf. And the great Australian tradition, you can spend it with everyone else. No one owns a beach in Australia. Everybody goes to the beach. Everyone can share. Everyone can enjoy being outside in a very physical world that we're in. And for those who don't know, sunshine is actually bright for your mood. And as my grandfather, who was Irish, said when he arrived, he was never going home. He took himself to the beach every day of his 90 years. He arrived. And was generally a good deal happier in the afternoon having been to the beach.
Absolutely. Yeah, you don't need to tell any Irish person that sun is good for them, honestly. Just to begin, for someone who is not familiar with your work, or how would you introduce yourself and your work over the last few decades?
Well, technically, I'm a clinical psychiatrist by training, so I'm a mental health professional. And a lot of my work clinically is with people with mood disorders, with depression, with manic depressive illness, bipolar disorder, and other common issues. As a researcher, I've tried my hand at just about everything: brain imaging, genetics, social determinants, testing new therapies, light therapy, circadian body clock therapies. But a lot of my life is actually as a public advocate. In the public discussion, what the hell is mental health and well-being, and how is it achieved? Not just individually, but as a public health issue for all of us. You know, it's basically an all-in. You've got to be well together if you're going to be well as an individual.
And just before, do you think that before, unfortunately, we were looking at it, at mental health quite sectionally, and we didn't understand the holistic nature of it?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of issues. We can blame the philosophers, the René Descartes and such people who put the mind over in one place, and I think religiously the spirit over in another, and then put the physiology of the body in the sort of animal world, the sort of non-religious, non-cognitive, and put it over there somewhere and split it up. And you know, humans are animals, and they are social animals that exist in a real world. And when they're unwell, the whole of them is unwell. So you're not psychologically unwell in some other place, in your spirit or in your mind, that is not connected, that is not intrinsically part of the whole. Same thing, the body itself doesn't exist as a physical thing in isolation from its social context. And really importantly, humans are social animals. Now, big message here, we don't survive on our own. We're actually quite fragile compared with the rest of the world. But we've been very successful when we survive in functional social groups together. So there's a holistic issue of mind and body, or mind in my world, mind and brain, if you like, the whole physiology of who you are. But that physiology itself is only in balance or in well-being when it's in some sort of equilibrium with the social world in which it operates, family, kin, society, etc., and functioning well. I say this particularly in the COVID era. You can see what happens when it goes wrong. It's very hard to survive. And in a psychological sense, in a mental health sense, same thing. Humans thrive psychologically when their group that they are part of is thriving, and many, many struggle when that breaks down for one set of reasons or another. So the holistic thing. Now, I think that is very important, Jim, because I think, unfortunately, now when I was young, I'm not so young, you can actually see me, I'm not as young as I used to be. When I was young, I was once a professor of community psychiatry, what used to be called a social psychiatrist, very fashionable 1970s hippie type job, social psychiatrist. But a lot of stuff happened in the 80s and 90s. One, of course, around brain imaging and genetics. We had a capacity to go inside our heads in a way that we didn't. But another really in cognitive psychology, to entirely get lost in about how we think about ourselves in isolation and trying to make ourselves right in our own head alone. So a lot of focus on the intrapsychic world of the individual, and I think out of balance with both its own physiology, the body and the world, the physical world that it's in, but also out of balance with the wider society within which we operate.
Absolutely. Like, when I first heard you speak about this topic in the recent event you hosted with the Dalai Lama on collective and well-being and resilience, you mentioned this before, and I had heard it like not in great depth, the idea that we really need the people around us to be doing well for our own well-being and vice versa, and that you criticize the idea of individual well-being. Like very, very much the American idea of you look after yourself. These are the things that you do and you will feel better. I just wanted to ask, one of the key issues that I've come across is in society, we see like, once I'm okay, it's okay. The kind of individualization of human goals and well-being, leading to like a weakening sense of community. And I guess, if you could speak further on this, on how this disconnection, while we believe it is better for us, we're looking after our personal and individual needs, it's actually hurting us because we have this maybe unconscious need for the people around us to be doing well. So also.
Yeah, look, so I think what has happened in the global world, and particularly over the last 30 or 40 years, this pursuit of individual wellness and length of life, the total preoccupation with being personally, physically fit and surviving, a ferociously individualistic kind of culture in a particular way. And then what has come on the back of that is commercialization of that, selling it to you, okay? Selling you everything from your personal trainer and your gym and your diet and, you know, your suntan and your job, and there's some individual success, and a fiercely individualistic ethos, which can be marketed around the world and sold around the world and promoted on Instagram and how you look and how, you know, as you know, I mean, in the Instagram age, down to just the physical appearance of you, and then in the sort of cosmetic world, how you rearrange even how you look, you know, so to be. I see these hilarious magazines when I used to travel in the United States of, you know, 70 and 80-year-old sort of models pretending on how you could look. I think they look terrible. But, you know, somehow you've got to look great when you're 80, you know, no wrinkles on your face, no whatever else. And then somehow on the inside, you'll be psychologically well, you know, this sort of pursuit of a kind of almost Statue of David kind of idea as you age, as the sort of glorified, godlike individual. And it's very easily marketed, and we are very susceptible. We're all very susceptible to that. Now, that's in a sort of gross kind of way. In the psychological world, as psychological awareness has grown, and an awareness that we do need to attend to our inner mental life in the same way that we now attend to our physical health, if you like, that has tended to get marketed as individual resilience and individual health and well-being, as if you can be well on the inside in isolation. Now, in health, as demonstrated by the COVID crisis pandemic, is complete nonsense in physical health. You can't be physically healthy independent of the environment in which you exist. You actually depend on a functioning physical environment to be well, for nutrition, for sunlight, for day, night, and for survival in the face of things like a pandemic. Same is true. Humans are social animals. Humans' great success from an evolution point of view is that at a group level, our capacity to care for each other, our empathy for each other, our capacity to support children through their development, to protect those who are sick and unwell at any particular time, therefore for us all to survive, depends on our emotional connection between us. And we feel well, we feel at our most productive, our most connected, when we're strongly connected with others and when we're strongly engaged with their well-being as well as our own. For any parent, for any family, for any others, be well aware if those that are close to you are very distressed or very unwell, you're not well yourself. And you really only thrive. I mean, we've just been through the Christmas period. Not sure how it went in Ireland and the UK and others, but, you know, not being able to connect with people, tremendously problematic. Here, as I was saying earlier on, I'm not really joking about it, it's really serious to see people on the beach, to really connect with people, to feel part of a community in that local way, be
Mm-hmm.
part of a family network. That's when you experience a sense of well-being. So attending to the mental health and well-being of the group is as important as understanding what is going on in yourself. And if you're not well, a lot of the solutions depends on other people actually assisting you to regain that well-being, not just getting lost in your own head. And that's one of the difficulties in the mental health world, is being open to the assistance of others when you're not struggling, and actually being able to interact in ways. And our willingness to reach out and connect. Now, I am fundamentally Irish by background, but I live with a lot of English people who actually don't like to reach out and touch or interfere or somehow invade the interpersonal space. I blame this as an Anglo-Celtic thing more generally, actually. I include the Irish here. If you're Latin and you're Spanish or Italian, and you're unwell, people are all over you, and then when you're unwell, there are tears, and when you're well, there's celebration and there's expression and there's facial expression, all of those things that communicate continuously the emotional temperature of what is going on. But in fact, are also linked to problem solving. In fact, it's, recognition that if we are unwell as social groups, now we are very lucky here in Australia that we have come to reside on the lands of our original indigenous people. And I must say, I'm very grateful to the people, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, in which I'm currently residing. They have a concept which translates poorly into English of social and emotional well-being. There is no individual well-being. There is only the social and emotional well-being of the group. And it's not a very physical well-being. It's actually the emotional well-being. It's actually the collective mental health. That's very interesting, because they had to survive in incredibly harsh climates in very small groups. And still they champion that, in fact, unless the group survives, they don't do well. They've actually done very well during the COVID era. Collectively, their intrinsic collectivism has actually stood them in good stead for the challenges that we now face in the physical environment. So I think there's an issue here that the global world, the commercialization of individualism internationally to sell, accompanied by, frankly, individual psychology, individual cognitive ideas. I get in control of my own head. I'll be resilient on my own. We'll win. Now, the commercialization is one. I'm glad you raised the issue with the Dalai Lama, because of course, a lot of people who do pursue meditation and mindfulness and are trying to get their own internal world into equilibrium, I'm not saying they're intrinsically selfish. I mean, that is a thing one has to be aware of. One has to be aware of one's own perturbations, one's own changes.
Totally.
But I would suggest one needs to be aware of the context in which that occurs, and whether the action that is required is just more meditation, or whether the action that is required is actually more activity. Real purpose in the wider world where that perturbation is actually occurring. What it is that is causing that perturbation, or how it is playing out for the individual who is affected.
Totally. And you mentioned that idea of there is no personal mental health with the indigenous population. And I recently read a quote from someone who was studying the indigenous population in North America, and they came across with a very similar thing. And I believe the quote was, "Those who get ill are canaries in the mine. They are showing us that the society is sick. Their healing is our healing." Isn't it just, doesn't it sound so true, but yet it's just the exact opposite of what we're going through?
Yes, it's a fascinating idea. I think if we take most of the First Nations peoples around the world, they had to survive in very harsh climates, in very harsh physical conditions, face really large challenges. But it's fascinating that they had it. So in a sense, people who became unwell physically, mentally, socially, the assumption was that they were being affected by the physical environment in some way, some threat. Now, that could have been a viral infection like we're seeing now with the pandemic. Makes some people sick, but not others. So what sits behind that is a fascinating concept of individual differences, okay? We don't all get COVID. We don't all get sick when we get COVID. We don't all end up in intensive care. Fortunately, we don't all die in the areas. Individual variations in response to things are variable, and you don't know. Some people like ex-President Trump think they're invulnerable. They get the virus and he survives, so what's wrong with the rest of you? Others, it could be of all ages, are struck down and sadly die very quickly. Not due to any fault of their own, not due to a weakness in their own, but because their own physiology, the intrinsic individual differences that we have are large. Now, humans need individual differences. The fact we're not all clones gives us a variety of different capabilities and responses, and that actually contributes to the survival of the social groups. If we're all clones, if we're all genetically identical, we'd all be dead, right? We would have all been wiped out by whatever it is that particular genotype was sensitive to. So actually diversity actually leads to survival. Very important concept. But it makes us differentially vulnerable to different kinds of stressors. Some physical, like virus infections, others psychological, emotional in different kinds of ways. One of the things that I really find interesting about mental health is a constant portrayal or a stigma that people with mental health problems are weak in some way, right? They're not strong, they're not resilient, Actually, those people are resilient, and Trump would be a good example, not fussed by anything, are some of the world's most insensitive and dangerous people, actually.
Absolutely.
Sensitive people, the canaries you're alluding to, sensitive people are required. In fact, if you think about child rearing, which is the most important thing in human survival, you need people who attend to children and are sensitive to their needs, care for them when they're sick, take care of them when they're vulnerable. Humans take, as we now recognise, about 25 years to develop into functional things, a really long time, okay? That requires a social group to actually take care. So environmental sensitivity, which is often seen as a weakness from a mental health point of view, to be upset by the environment, is actually a strength of the group, okay? To be aware of the needs of others is actually intrinsic. So, it's a really important kind of set of issues. So different kinds of perturbations in the external world, including in the emotional world, will affect some people more than others, depending on their own genotype, like their own intrinsic DNA, but also on their own sets of experiences. And really what that all determines is different emotional tone. So, people who've never experienced a mental health problem pat themselves on the back and think, well, I'm a pretty strong sort of guy. I'm a resilient kind of guy. Yeah. The corollary might be, actually, you're a pretty insensitive person, actually. And too many of you, and we'd all be dead. No one would take care of anyone. So, it's a mix, and therefore a mix in the social group. So, emotional sensitivity, emotional connection, a willingness, a genuine empathy, or genuine understanding of the distress of others in particular ways. I don't want to get too political. I'm very glad to see an Irishman, Joe Biden, now become president of the United States, because I think there's some hope that the empathy of the Irish might actually expand. A fundamental kind of emotional tone might return to public policy in that country and affect the rest of us. Terrible thing the pandemic has been. But, you can only solve the problems through collective action. Well, I'd say the same thing is true for the emotional world that we're living in. So the emotional world to function is a collectivist undertaking. How we differentially each respond to changes in that world is tied up in our own identity, determined by both our genetics but also by our own environmental experiences. But we need the sensitive people, right? The goal of mental health is not to make people less sensitive. It's another part of my professional world, It's not to make people bulletproof. It's not to turn them into Trump-like supporters of the world, right? It's to make them actually aware that the sensitivity, they are picking up things and they are affected by things in ways that others aren't. That's not a weakness, it's a difference. And that difference is very important to the social group.
This is really profound when you talk about this, because often what I see on social media and what I experience sometimes is that there's almost like a grouping, but of these sensitive people you talk about and of these insensitive people complaining about each other, when really, if I understand you correctly, we need to appreciate that both of these groups are necessary for us to proceed.
Yeah. So let's get back to talk about First Nations peoples and other sets of stuff. Some people had to go out in the world and be prepared to do stuff that would scare the wits out of a lot of the rest of us. Okay. I'm basically a bit of a scaredy cat myself. I'm not a person for jumping out of airplanes and, hang gliding. I'm a bit fearful of other stuff, or running through the bush and chasing after snakes and spiders. And then trust me, in Australia, we've got a lot of them, or, swimming across the bay. A marvellous thing the other day of a man who jumped into a pool in Australia because his girlfriend was being attacked by a shark. And he punched the shark in the head, right? He jumped into the pool and punched the shark in the head, right? Now, that's the sort of bloke you need in your world. Not very fearful, not very unwell. And I must say, I'm the father of 4 daughters. Geez, he's not like me, but he might make a good son-in-law, that bloke. You've got to have different levels of being able to contain fear, sensitivity, different levels of doing things. So variations are important, so some degrees of insensitivity or being less able. I mean, in my world, for example, as a doctor, I see surgeons and intensive care people and other sets of things who do things, physical things, and have to do surgical, which really require tremendous capacity to put aside the effect on the other person. Right? What is actually happening, the pain, the suffering, the injury, to actually achieve the outcome. So, it's often said that a number of my surgical friends are a bit insensitive, right? But I'm very grateful that actually when I'm fast asleep, they do really good things for me, and I'm very grateful to wake up and they're not fussed about it. The blood and guts and gore and whatever, I couldn't care less, just a bit of carpentry, back together, all good, carry on. So being able to having this diversity of emotional tone and groups is very important, and it has always been important to survival. Interestingly, at the extremes, of course, it's problematic. If you're so fearful or so sensitive you can't do anything, or you're so insensitive that you put others at risk, that's a problem. But, the majority of us lies somewhere in the middle of those things. But in terms of diversity in the population, sure, you see particular sets of areas of difference.
Thanks for that, Ian. That's fantastic. The next thing, just to go back to what you were saying previously, on the idea that we need to, people who might be into meditation or some these practices, contemplative practices, we also need to realize that there are times where we need to focus on the collective rather than the personal. And I was wondering, like, in your opinion, how can we balance the well-being, the individual well-being, with the collective? Because, like, even personally, I recently wrote an article on the importance of boundaries, and if I am content if I'm mostly content when my tribe is content, am I relying too heavily on external matters for a personal contentness, satisfaction? Or have you found difficulty with this in your own life?
Well, I suppose it depends where you've got options. I come from a large Irish Catholic family. I got 6 children. I got lots of relatives. I live in a very rich professional world. The option that I could somehow exist, in a state of wellness, if all of that was in perturbation and, not happening, isn't realistic. Now, it does mean, however, it does mean we all need to think about, in terms of our activities, to what extent at times do we need, in a sense, time out? We need times to moderate our own internal world when it's getting very perturbed by those things. Okay. So if you are more sensitive to those things, you're a key part of that. The danger is that you can be perturbed a lot by a lot of things that are happening. So if you're one of the people, the canaries you alluded to earlier, you can be upset a lot. And you may need to learn skills not to become less sensitive, but to be less perturbed by all those things, to moderate some of those things, and how to take actions. And I suggest the actions are twofold. Some is by internal. For some people, mindfulness, meditation, internal times, time out works. For others, I often make the comment, often for a lot of men, it's actually doing things. It may actually be playing sport, going to the gym, other activities, where actually they're doing something physical, but they are relaxing. And, and for many others, it's essentially problem solving, not just reacting to the world, but taking actions to resolve problems. Humans are also much more mentally well when they're problem solving rather than being just reacting to the particular kind of set of issues. To use a big example again, I think you might see a change in American collective well-being when he has a president that's focused on solving the problem, getting the vaccine out, working together. We're solving the problem. We're not pretending it isn't there or trying to make up the science to make it go away or presenting alternative facts or, doing things that actually just increase people's distress about the particular sort of situation. So even if you haven't solved a problem, if you're in the process, individually or collectively, of taking actions towards it, you'll generally feel better. So in crises, when we react, when we get together, and often in many crises, communities, functional communities, do pull together, then actually, despite the fact the external world is going really badly, people feel quite good about that. They actually come together with common purpose to do that. So I think the issue is not to just be a cork in the ocean and be pushed around continuously by everything that is happening, but to be an active element. So even if you are one of the sensitive people that is more perturbed by what is happening, you need to have the skills, the cognitive, the behavioural, the emotional skills to actually moderate your own response to those issues and really learn what works for you. So if mindfulness, meditation works for you, great, but just don't spend the whole day at it. If actually activity works for you, if problem solving, if engaging works for you, if drinking alcohol works for you, bad idea, right? But if actually physical exercise works for you, if sleeping better, so I think one of the things many people need to find out, which they don't find out as teenagers is what works. And I'd make the simple comment that often when people are working as parts of groups effectively, they find that works much better than just retreating to their internal self, and actually hoping that just meditation, not just meditation, but retreating. But what some people do, and why I'm so critical of a lot of this individual stuff, is frankly, it's just avoidant, right? It's actually just pulling back and hoping the problem won't be there tomorrow. And that makes the situation worse, right? Yeah. The classic, really big challenges for young people at the moment in employment, in education, and can't travel. If you just say, I'll just have to wait till the pandemic's over and I'll just meditate till it's over. That isn't going to help, really. You're going to, trying to find more productive ways to engage. And whether that's, throwing your efforts into creative arts or into music or into collective, doing other things to collectively and engaging and developing, despite the fact that external circumstances have become very difficult. What is it that you do in these situations? So I think this is where, when I was younger, psychological therapies used to be called cognitive and behavioural. And somewhere along the line in the late 1980s and 90s, the behavioural bit got a bit dropped in favour of the cognitive, just thinking about it. You can't actually fix your own thoughts without doing stuff. And actually, when you do stuff, you think differently. It's interesting. I've just come back to work. A common story in medicine is you run into, and I ran into a few of them during our summer break here, you run into surgeons on the beach who suddenly become fearful about doing surgery. They're sort of anxious about whether they're a good surgeon or whatever else. They start to worry when they're not doing. And you ask them 2 days after they go back to the work, are they worried anymore? They go, no, don't be ridiculous. I've been back at work. It's all fine. It's all fine. I'm back doing what I was doing. I don't worry about it. I don't even think about it anymore. I'm just back, sewing things back together and hammering them back together, and doing what I'm doing. We actually are far less anxious, many of us, when we're doing what we can do, rather than when we're not doing and we're worrying about it in particular ways. So for many mental health problems with anxiety, with fearfulness, with in depression and other areas, the doing precedes the feeling better and thinking better about it, not the other way around. And I think a problem with a lot of the misunderstandings of a lot of cognitive approaches is I've got to get right in my head first before I do anything, which results in never doing anything and being more lost in your own head than you were to start with.
That's interesting because we had a guy on, Christopher Boyce, a few months ago, and he talked about, while I believe what you're saying is true, he also talked about the idea that maybe people need to improve at the idea of just sitting and being with themselves and not constantly doing things and not really sure why they're doing things. So again, it's all about balance.
Well, that's an interesting idea too. I mean, what I am is I'm putting an emphasis in here on activity, but not frenetic, purposeless, useless activity. Not running around, making noise, and not being effective. Now, I don't get too political, but I will. Let's take the American president for the last year in the face of the pandemic, saying stupid things and running around with frenetic things and having press conferences all the time and pretending it's okay. Like lots of activity, lots of noise, lots of Fox News, lots of whatever else actually makes the situation worse. Okay? Frenetic activity, purposeless activity doesn't help. So a lot of the times people do need to stop and not be a cork in the ocean, not just be reacting to the next thing, is actually go, hang on, not what is immediate, but what is important. So the modern world and the modern technical world that we live in and all the devices that we have are all designed to immediately capture your attention continuously and have you respond before you've even thought, what was my own name or what day of the week is it? You're reacting to something in the online worlds that we have. They're attention grabbing. But this often results in useless frenetic activity. And of course, the danger is it disconnects you from the world actually around you in particular kinds of ways, potentially, when particular things. So I think that's an important kind of concept of, in the worlds that we're in, certainly a lot of my own research is in body clocks, is in actually the 24-hour cycle, which includes, and very important, I say this to young people, going to sleep during the dark period and being physically active during the light period, the daylight, the sun period, and how we do that every day, the rhythms in which we do that, and how much purposeful activity did you do today, as distinct from how much time did you spend in nothingness? Activity, but activity without meaning, activity without purpose. And I would say, in this context we're talking, activity without well-being.
I get you.
Don't even know whether I did anything today that made me or anyone else feel any better about the world. Yes, I was busy, but I got to say, I was busy with nonsense, in a particular. And then that kind of stuff, I think, does then. When people have spent a lot of energy and a lot of time, and they go at the end of it, for what? I just feel more aroused. I just feel more perturbed. I just feel now I can't sleep, and So again, to come back to an earlier comment you made about a whole thing, our physiology has a whole natural rhythm to it. I say this because I used to travel to pre-2020 to Europe and the UK and North America because I have relatives and work all the time. If you've ever been jet lagged by traveling halfway around the world, which Australians are constantly, in our businesses, you'll be well aware that your body is out of sync with the actual natural rhythms of the day. It's very hard to function when you're out of sync. But it makes you very aware of body rhythms too. You can't think, you can't react, you can't eat, you can't sleep, unless the whole thing is in synchrony on an ongoing basis. We don't often think about that in our everyday lives, in our own environment. But what is it we need to do as we pass through the passage of a day, in being physically active, in being mentally active, in being socially engaged, that has a rhythm to it? And we are not machines. You cannot be emotionally on 24/7. You can't operate to the same degree, with the same degree of depth or tone. So developing rhythm. So when people build things like meditation. Now, I tell you, I may have mentioned to the Dalai Lama, I'm not a really great mindfulness guy myself. I prefer to do things with people, play games, whatever. But I have been dragged over the summer period by my partner in life, who is English and an exercise, to yoga 3 days a week, which I got to say, I don't repeat this widely, okay, if you're listening, I physically hate it, okay, I hate it. I'm an aging man with bits that don't bend or stretch or whatever, surrounded by all these other people who can bend and stretch and do stuff and whatever. But it's interesting because it's as it's been over my own summer break, whether I like it or not, it's been scheduled by the people in my life into significant numbers of mornings each week, which is the right time to do it. It's the right time of day to actually do that stuff as part of the way your hormonal system, your metabolic system adapts to the day to do it in a particular way, to stretch and blah, 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 blah. And I have to confess, even though I don't want to, that as a consequence of that, I feel better. Not just physically, because the physical bit's all, in fact, I feel physically worse. Here's the bottom line. I feel physically worse. It really hurts, right? But mentally, I feel better, right? It requires a concentration on the physical. Other stuff out of your head, I can't even bend that way. I can't even imagine how those people do that sort of stuff. But, I'm concentrating on my own physiology. But interestingly, here's the other point, doing it as a group, not doing it as a personal thing. I'd never do it individually. I'm being dragged into it by the group I'm part of, and I don't ever do it as part of a group, right? So we're actually all collectively engaging in something as a group, physiological, but it's also in the rhythm of the day, a part of the particular thing. If you're really in mental health trouble, doing something physical every day, and it might be something like yoga, but it might be exercise, trying to get the rhythm of life back, which is commonly lost in mental health problems, is just as an important part of getting right in your head as any other cognitive or emotional or medical intervention. So there are aspects of us as humans that in the modern world we've put aside or we've disrupted at the social group level, but also in the fundamental rhythms of everyday life.
Thanks for that, Ian. I was going to ask this towards the end, but now that you've brought this up and you're bringing up very wholesome pieces of advice for people who may be experiencing some difficulty, are there any other chief lessons that maybe you learned as a mental health commissioner, or is there anything else that you really try to embody in your life on a regular basis because you think it's so fundamental that maybe the listeners may not be aware of?
Yeah, look, in the public world that I've been in, both originally as the CEO of what's called Beyond Blue, our National Depression Awareness Campaign, which got going here in the early 2000s, and then as a National Mental Health Commissioner, is the huge gap in understanding between what is known about many of these things and what many people think is commonsensical, or worse, what has been marketed to them as what they should do. Right? And this is where the kind of problems of stigma and misunderstanding and lack of these actually arise from. So if you like, a lot of the science behind this, the social science, the neurobiology and many other things, which is very elaborate and goes ahead quickly, doesn't easily fit with a lot of common ideas. We mentioned some earlier, common ideas about weakness, or that sensitivity is a bad thing, or that resilience means you become bulletproof and insensitive to others in various ways, or the importance of collective action for humans as social animals in particular sets of issues. And that well-being, probably the most fundamental, is that well-being is a physiological state, right? It's not an airy-fairy thing that you can go purchase, and put on. It's not a new set of clothes. It can't be changed with the season, like something down from the, I'm not sure what the most, I don't want to bag too many brands here, but whatever the brand of clothing is most popular in your part of the world that changes its look and its color every 6 weeks, so you'll buy a new one. This is not the world of human well-being. It isn't played out in very short-term processes. And so probably the most important thing I'd say is that, and pick up a point about individual differences too, is understanding this kind of thing about individually, you need to sort out you need to attend to your mental health, attend to your mental health and find out what works for you to keep you in balance. Because we can all be thrown, we all will be thrown. As a very famous person once said, life is tough and then you die, right? If you think you're going to go through life and not experience stress and difficulties, forget it. The physical world we live in is very challenging and then you die, right? Mm-hmm. It's going to be stressful. Stuff's going to happen. And because as humans, we are very emotionally connected with others, stuff's going to happen to the people we care about around us too. And we're going to be affected by that, whether we like it or not. So the fact that we get upset, the fact that we get distressed is entirely appropriate from an evolutionary and survival point of view, to be distressed, right? But how you cope with it, you need to find out what works best for you, and then within the groups that you're in, what works best for the people you care about, for the small world networks that you're part of. So cherishing the small world networks, working at keeping those networks well, is fundamental, if you're a selfish person, to keeping yourself well, okay? Actually, and as well as what works for you. When I'm struggling, when I'm having difficulty with, let's say, not that the University of Sydney isn't a marvellous employer, it is, but let's just say working in the areas in which I work can be a bit challenging from time to time. Let's say the health system. The mental health system continuously is a challenge. That's a nice way of putting it. And it's rather difficult to get it to change and respond to the needs of people with mental health problems. But no point me being upset all the time about that. How do I turn that into productive action in my role as a public advocate, in my role as an educator, as my role as a clinician? What other things do I need to do? And I was just confessing to one. I'm taking the opportunity here, Jim, of confessional, okay? Just telling you, I do hate physical activity, but I need it. So despite my, objections and protestations and grumpiness when dragged into these activities in the early morning, because I'm not a morning person either, I've got to confess I need to do it. In fact, as I age, I need to do it more. You may not be aware, but your body clock, the thing in your head, it's pretty much clapped out by the time you're 35. After that, you've actually got to work to schedules every day to keep you in those body rhythms I was talking about earlier on, and physical activity matters. So whether I like it or not, I have to concede, and despite what I say, I have to do that stuff to stay well. Now, I know that, right? A lot of people who actually have mood problems know that even more. They know that if they do not get physically active, we've seen a fascinating thing here in Australia. I don't know if you've seen it with quarantine. People have had to go into hotel rooms for 2 weeks, and suddenly find they get depressed, they're miserable, they can't cope at all because they were normal outside being physically active and doing things. They didn't realise the extent to which they used physical activity to moderate their own mood and their own capacity to cope every day in particular areas. They only found out by being locked up for 2 weeks in a hotel room and not being able to do anything. So finding out how to manage your own well-being, and then collectively with a group that you're part of, what things actually really matter to you. And I might say in that context, slightly different, another point that I would make is also who. Historically, this may sound a bit controversial, but historically we put far too much emphasis on family and kin, right?
Yeah.
Blood relatives.
Mm-hmm.
In the modern world, people you work with, people in your local community. Funny thing about the COVID world, which I think Australians have rediscovered because we value this collective things, this mateship ideas. Some of my favourite people run the local coffee shop, run the local restaurant. I live in an apartment block. They're people I share an apartment block with. They're not blood relatives. As I said at one of my own daughter's weddings a few years ago, don't get family, get good friends. You can rely on them. Family are trouble. Good friends are much better, on an ongoing basis. Who is it? Who is it that you can actually rely on and work with? And they're not through the responsibilities of simply being family or kin, but because you choose those relationships to support each other. In a mental health world, when you're struggling, having people who are really good friends, you've chosen to form those social bonds. A lot of that's through the workplace these days, and we don't rely so much on things we relied on in the past, churches, sporting groups, community groups. A lot of it's work-related, it's other social things. They're really important. So I would say a number of those other things that people don't think about, really building those social bonds, not just with family and kin, but with others of like mind and similar, values and sensitivity, is tremendously important in these times. And not to be all the same, not just necessarily with people who are exactly the same, but, rich social networks that support us and challenge us and help us get through these periods. So what you see, in fact, I think, again, in the COVID era, The communities that are coping best have this strong social, not just saving my family or not just saving my people, but the world in which I'm in, the functioning world in which I'm in, the city in which I'm in, the apartment block in which I'm in, the neighbourhood. And a lot of social theory and a lot of issues about actually big cities that really work. They're actually not one big city. They're not surrounded suburbs. They're networks of small villages. Dublin, marvellous place, but the small village bits within Dublin that work. You know, New York is actually a series of boroughs, and the boroughs themselves work. People walk and share. They share the same things. They're not just locked up in their own castle in the great American suburb or the great Australian McMansion of a type thing with their own backyard and locked off. You'll die. You'll get depressed and then you'll die in there. You know, you actually need to share the world, the physical world. Go to cafes, to eat out, to be part of this, to be in parks, to sporting groups, to do things together. Maybe Irish pubs, but not too much of the alcohol. But, the collective activity. You see these people join choirs and they do other things. Like the doing collectively is tremendously important to well-being. In fact, many of the things that historically we did do, sing together, dance together, pray together, lunch together, celebrate together, they're a bit lost in the modern world, where we're all a bit more disconnected in the physical sense. Now, having said that, I think there are tremendous advantages to new technologies when they're used well, but I think some of those things that we did collectively really, really underpinned this concept that I'm driving at. It ain't just family. It isn't just blood relatives. It's the collective group. It's interesting, again, in the indigenous world, one of my favourite people in the world, an older indigenous woman called Auntie Joy, who lives as part of my family in our collective sort of home. She's called Auntie Joy because, as many older indigenous women are in Australia, because she's an auntie to everyone. Now, when the English arrived, they couldn't understand this at all. How can you be an auntie to 55 people, or someone refers to someone as being a sister? They go, well, I don't know what you English mean. We don't mean the blood relatives. We mean the people we're responsible for. We mean all the particular people we take in. It's not a question of whether they're a blood relative or not. In fact, we're not entirely sure who is a blood relative or not of everybody else, because it's shared and the responsibility is shared. So the title of auntie is one of great social significance, respect for somebody who plays a role in many people's lives, the mentoring of young people, taking kids who are in trouble, other things, not just family, not just direct kin in a particular way. Now, I think that kind of idea and for different people in society enacting those roles, and who do you go to and who supports you? So one thing I'd say to people is, do you know who you would go to if you were really in trouble? And who would you go to support if they were in trouble? I have quite a funny story with some other teenage friends. I'm the father of four. I'm a father of many children, I think. But I'm the father of four daughters. And as my four daughters say, you're a hopeless parent, Dad. You're hopeless. But that's okay, because we have lots of other aunts and uncles and others who are really good. So the fact that you're hopeless is all right, because we have a lot of others to choose from, temperamentally. Interestingly, I have a very close male friend, and his teenage, now older daughter, his daughter calls me Auntie Ian. And she thinks I make quite a good aunt, that I'm quite practical about the problems that she actually has. And she thinks that I'm better than her dad. We are not blood relatives at kind of understanding some of the complexity of her life at a critical stage in a particular thing. So this notion of what's the wider social world that really cares about you? Who would care about you? And who do you care for? Who can you play a productive role with? Because at various times in our lives, we're all going to need it. And it's going to matter a lot to your mental health or well-being, just as when you're physical health. You might ask the same question. If you're physically sick, who would you want to take care of you? Now, as my daughters say, no way are we ever taking care of you, Dad. You better hire good carers. I say that's good, because when I get sick, I want good professional carers. I want people who do the job well, who are good at it, not just anybody. This, and to think about that in a mental health way too. Who would you be good for, and who would be good for you? It's a really interesting thing. And because if you don't have those people now, think about it.
This is crucial, Ian, and what comes to mind even is the closing of rural Irish pubs, which has really decimated like sections of the community because they don't meet the people in their community as they had before. But what I'd like to bring up now is how you believe that facilitating digital mental facility for people can actually help these people that are isolated and that say that they are searching for a face-to-face connection. But I've heard you speak about the idea that actually the people who are isolated, these digital mental health services can help them the most.
Yeah. So you just said the key word. You said searching for face-to-face connection. I would say searching for connection. Right? Searching for connection. The assumption that connection has to be face-to-face is a very 19th century. Just remember when the Irish went all around the world, it was before you could actually ring on the telephone and phone home, right? There's a very famous set of ads for the telephone company, the National Telephone Company in Australia in the 1970s, when we had really international telephones became affordable. And the big ad was phone home. And it showed Irish relatives in Australia, Irishmen in Australia ringing Ireland and being in tears talking to their mum, right? It showed Italians ringing home to Sicily talking to their mum, whatever else, The connection was still there. It showed faces crying and everyone going, it was the connection. It wasn't face-to-face. It was just the telephone, little old telephone. Imagine that in the internet age, a telephone, Actually, the sound of a voice, the sound of connection, just knowing the connection was there in the world. So connection is fundamental to human well-being. Now, you said a very important thing as well. The world has changed. Rural pubs, I'm not very big on Catholicism, but rural churches, my mum is. My mum's very big on Catholicism. She used to say, look, Ian, I know you don't like those priests and all that other stuff, but we all used to go to church on Sundays and we would connect, right? Mm-hmm. The connection was there. It's the connection. As all of those other social institutions disappeared, we now have a way of connecting with people world over. And this morning on my way to work, my partner in life is phoning her nephew in California to discuss the mental health, or the healthcare of her brother in Sheffield in the United Kingdom, right? They are all transacting stuff related to getting urgent healthcare for her brother in Sheffield via his son in California, via our medical knowledge in real time. They are incredibly connected. They're all distressed because he's unwell and it's complicated, and they're all participating. And best still, she's on the thing to the, doctor who doesn't care in the NHS in the UK, who's under a lot of pressure at the moment, to make the world happen. So technology has shrunk the world. When my Irish grandfather came to Australia, he never saw, with his brother, he never saw his other 5 living brothers and sisters ever again. Never saw them again. Once you went to another part of the world, that was it. That was the break in that sort of set of connection. Now, connection. So despite the breakdown in those very local networks you've alluded to, like the pubs and the churches and the local things, we now have a way of connecting in a different way. And also often with people we wouldn't have otherwise connected with. Now, a lot of people in those old worlds were also disconnected. They couldn't get to the pub. They had other sets of difficulties. They couldn't find people, who had same-sex attractiveness or thought like them or behaved like them or had other disabilities. All sorts of people now can connect with people experiencing very similar things and can stay connected to people despite being physically distant. So the appropriate use of technologies, it picks up our general theme, I think, here, Jim. My interest in many of these things is in social connection. My interest in technology isn't just that you do it yourself as an individual app for your depression or anxiety or your individual smartphone or whatever. In fact, hilariously, if you see kids with smartphones, the idea that anyone owns a smartphone is a rather weird one. I just knock off yours and I use mine, and like whatever else, They're just collective. They're just stuff to knock off. There's no individual identity. It's an interesting kind of. So my enthusiasm for technology is connection. and disconnection, particularly across areas, and also and is connecting in the health world, the clinical world I'm in, connecting with expertise. Australia, like Canada and many other places, it's a long way. If you think it's a long way from Galway to Dublin, try, Sydney to Darwin, or, across Australia in many particular areas. Most of the mental health professionals in Australia live in Sydney and Melbourne, and then in the richer suburbs in those particular areas, providing mental health services, connection. I'm tied up in work in Colombia in South America. It's a fabulous work led by young Colombian psychiatrists there, of using technology, in developing countries and using others for services, for information, but connection. Just remember, Facebook was invented by young people to connect with each other in real time, to go out and do stuff, to message. And the advent of what you now call social media, which is really only from 2008 onwards, is all about connection. Now, so if used appropriately, I think it has a terrible... Now, just imagine this pandemic if we didn't have the technology we had. Within a month in Australia, all of our schools went over to being online. Schools would otherwise close down. Kids would not have seen each other. There would have been no education. Healthcare provision went over onto telehealth within a month, stuff we should have done 10 years ago, because the technology exists. So in my view, when the technology is put to good use, it has a tremendous capability. Now, this is highly contestable at the moment. In fact, I've written elsewhere about the Uberization of digital mental health. Now, I'm not saying Uberization is good or bad. I'm just saying it's going to happen, right? There's a private sector, there's other things here. I'm really interested in the extent to which, when technology disrupts the worlds we're in, we might see a good outcome rather than not. And I think a lot of that will provide access, will provide information, will provide tools. But one of the critical aspects, I guess the theme of this whole discussion we're having is, does it effectively promote social connection, hold people together in meaningful ways, or does it undermine in some way or other? However, just to challenge all of my favourite professionals, the face-to-face thing isn't as important as we say. And, it's not all... People don't always want face-to-face. I don't go back to Irish Catholicism, but the notion of the confessional, the guy on the other side that you couldn't see, who was sort of God or something, right? You didn't want to see some old grumpy face giving you did what? Disapproving. You want to be able to say, in fact, back in the 1980s, I was tied up in much more fun things like sex research, and people would tell computers, old computer laptops, things you couldn't even imagine, all sorts of things about what they did that they would never tell a person, because the person would disapprove. If I see a young woman walk into my office with an eating disorder and she looks at me, an old fat guy, she goes, I'm not going to tell that guy what I'm really up to. She sees somebody else who looks like her, or she'll tell another young woman what she's up to. She'll tell a computer what she's up to. So the idea that people necessarily disclose to health professionals, or that they don't necessarily, but people don't necessarily share their thoughts. We see this with suicidality. We see it with other things. So there's a disclosure issues, there's connection issues. And the face-to-face bit, I think, is about connection. It's not literally about face-to-face. It's about the emotional tone. Can I connect with something and with people who get what I'm on about and why my world is perturbed? And in my view, technology can greatly facilitate that. And we have a new opportunity to do that in particular ways, and do that with people who would otherwise never have access to that kind of expertise and connection. You can stay connected around the world. You can be connected in your local pub, and I strongly recommend the local pub, but not too much of the local Guinness.
In moderation.
But, marvelous thing, not too much of it. But, staying connected, and in fact, in the more challenging times that we're in, and when people go, so I've been involved in, for example, modelling the mental health impacts of COVID. And there are two big things that make the mental health world worse in the COVID era. One's unemployment, financial difficulties. The other's social disconnection, being forced to disconnect. Well, the social disconnection, probably one of our biggest ways of dealing with that for the foreseeable future, is through technology. is doing exactly what we're doing now, having these conversations. Now, I would say within that, there are telecommunications infrastructure issues. Being able to see faces, being able to hear voices, being able to interact in real time. These are, undoubtedly important aspects of the things. But I do go back to the 1970s, the Australian Telephone Company. Just the voice, just knowing you can phone home and mum's still there, as always, and whether she's in Sicily or she's in Dublin or she's in Seattle, it doesn't matter. I have a son and a granddaughter in Montreal in Quebec who I talk to regularly via, FaceTime and whatever else, right? That kid, I've met my granddaughter, but unfortunately haven't seen her for the last year, but she can get on a FaceTime thing and go, it's that funny old grandpa person down there. Makes her laugh in a particular way. Not the same as rolling around the lounge room with her, but, it is maintaining the connection during an otherwise time when we would otherwise be disconnected, so that the mental representation. So technology, my whole discourse here is if technology is used appropriately, and particularly in these times of crisis and connection, then we are able to connect with people. In fact, the world's oldest online suicide prevention program comes from Australia, and it runs out through an organisation called Reach Out. And it was set up in 1996. Imagine what the internet was like in 1996. And a guy called Jack Heath, very sadly, his nephew had suicided in rural Australia at the time. Okay. And Jack's pretty convinced that if someone had been able to reach out, or his nephew had been able to reach out to someone in that dark period, his nephew would still be alive. Not being able to connect at that time of crisis, there was no way of connecting with someone who was in crisis in a particular way. And that led him to establish this first internet-based suicide prevention to assist kids in tough times, So I think the potential is there, but we've got to be smart about how it is best used. And we're all on a learning journey. There's a lot of upsides and downsides to modern technology. But I remain an enthusiast or an optimist. In my fundamental Irishness, Jim, I remain a fundamental optimist that all being well, technology will probably be a good thing.
And for listeners and for myself who maybe just want a clearer picture of how, I heard you mention that digital platforms can actually improve the idea of personalized care. Would you have an example to give to us about how the digitalization of mental health care has really helped provide a personalized care package or care help to, say, someone in rural Australia or someone with PTSD or someone with suicidal thoughts?
Yes, let's take all of those. You got another hour, Jim? Yes, we can cover all of those. I don't know if you've ever been to a clinic recently or a doctor or whatever. The doctor, I don't know how it works in the kind of Irish system, but, the doctor might have 5 minutes, the psychologist might have 10. Now, what's the problem? Now, let's keep it short, okay? Let's not get too late. No, I ain't going to deal with the problem. No, let's keep it focused, okay? Are you suicidal today or not? What's the problem today or not? What are we going to solve today? Hang on. My life's more complicated than that. Oh, no. We got to, whatever it is, we got to limit the period. Now, one of the great things about online technologies is if you use them appropriately, then people who have a story to tell and they want you to understand the richness. So in the world I'm in, you can use technologies for what we call multidimensional and highly personalized assessment. You can actually use those things before you get to the clinic to describe who you are, the symptoms you've got, the relationships you're in, the needs that you've got, financial, personal, social, mental health, physical health. You can collect all that data beforehand and not be edited out by the clinician to only being this bit or that bit. No, I don't want to hear about your drug and alcohol problem. No, I don't want to hear about your suicidality. I don't want to hear about your sleep today or all this today. You can actually put it in there. You can also prioritize that. Suicidality is a fascinating thing because, for example, obviously in mental health world, are you suicidal today or not? Because if you are, we've got to do something. If you're not, we can wait till tomorrow type idea we have running.
Yeah.
Now,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes in many situations, that is the most important thing to deal with today. For others, not so. For example, we have use this issue with war veterans and a lot of people with PTSD who have suicidal thinking a lot all the time. And they don't want to be asked every day, are they suicidal or not? In fact, it's not. They know it's there. It's not the thing that's worrying them the most. The thing that's worrying them most is their wife's about to leave, or they've lost their job, or they're about to lose their home. There's some other factor that's worrying them the most in a particular way. So technologies allow people to say what is the biggest priority to them. They allow the whole picture to be there. They allow the person's needs to precede the allocation of resources to help that. So I was discussing just yesterday with some of the new issues running in some of the new clinics we have. You might, for example, turn up and you might be depressed and have a mental health need, but you might also have a really serious financial problem and your relationship, your wife might be about to leave, right? You might have 3 or 4 things. You might actually need 3 or 4 different professionals. You might need financial need, you might need welfare need, you might need relationships, and you may need treatment for your depression. You may need a team of people. So we, therefore, provide the services that you need, not just what our shop does. I'm sorry, we only do this. Drug and alcohol. We don't do drug and alcohol. We don't do relationship counselling. We don't do financial support. You'll have to go off down the road to 6 other agencies or not and sort that out yourself, in the middle of the crisis you're in. So this multidimensional assessment, getting the information in, and then that actually being tracked over time. I say to people all the time, funny thing to say, I don't care how you get well. I care if you stay unwell or you get worse. So I want to track over time against the things that you've said were important. Did we actually improve them or not? And if they're not getting better or you've suddenly got suicidal, I want someone to do something about it. I want the system to recognise that whatever it recommended. I give people a lot of advice about sleep-wake cycles and activity and do stuff, and I send them off with their mobile phones to track it, right? And they come back to me, it was 4 weeks or 6 weeks later, with, I'm showing a picture of their whole sleep-wake cycle and go, that's very good, Dr. Hickie, but what you said didn't work. And here's my actual sleep-wake cycle, right? Mm-hmm. Not what you said in general. Here is my sleep-wake cycle, my personal activity pattern. Now, if they did what I said and it didn't work, I got to recommend something different. However, if they didn't do what I said, that's also obvious too. I suggested you get out of bed in the morning. You got out of bed in the morning, I suggest you go down, So this working with, in partnership, working with real personal data over time at the assessment end and then seeing it through. When you're the suicidality thing is fascinating because lots of people are suicidal. And the clinicians go, no, they're not. And I go, yes, they are. And in fact, they're quite often suicidal when you're not seeing them, but you're not doing anything about it because you don't know it. There's no signaling system. There's no red flag. There's no warning sign kind of. So we miss the opportunity to assist. People, when they go to the doctor and they go to the clinic or they go to the psychologist, they tend to put a good face on it. They tend to behave, pretty well. Oh, yeah, I'm a bit better. Oh, yeah, I'm doing the best I can. Oh, yeah, I'm grateful, even if you're only here for 30 minutes of the next 6 months, whatever. They're kind of be nice to their doctors. They're nice to their psychologists. They're nice to the nurses. But actually, they're struggling a lot of the time. They're really doing it. And you can see that, So the clinician can go, oh, my God, actually, this person's really struggling quite a lot, and at different times and in different situations. So what actually emerges is a much more personal trace, a personal record of what's really going on and on more than one dimension at one time. We can walk and chew gum. We can do more than one thing. A doctor working in partnership with a psychologist and a social worker and a welfare agency and an employment agency. In Headspace, our youth agencies, now a significant proportion have employment support or education support. Lots of the kids I see say, look, I don't want to be so fearful, but to tell you the truth, I really want to get back to school. I really want to go out with people. I really want to have a relationship. I got to be back functioning, not just having my depressive symptoms or my anxiety symptoms go up or down. There's a lot of other things to be done. A lot of people with mental health problems have concurrent physical health problems, certainly have concurrent alcohol or drug problems that need to be dealt with, to use your term, holistically, together. So we have a notion here of right care first time, and preferably where you live. You preferably shouldn't have to travel the length of Ireland. You shouldn't have to all go to Dublin to get well, get anything in a particular thing. It should be able to be delivered. My family comes, I hate to say this, from a very small parish on the west coast, and having been there a few years ago, the west coast of Ireland, it must have been, at its time, a very long way from Dublin, And these days, if you're struggling, you're a kid who's struggling on the west coast of Ireland in a particular way, you need help today. You don't need a clinic appointment in 8 weeks' time somewhere, and then you wait another week, and then you're probably not going to get what you want anyway, and you're probably going to see some old bloke like me who's not really that interested in what's affecting you anyway, or wants to tell you how tough life was when I was young. You want something that responds, that understands, tracks, and then, actually sorts out in real time, is this what works for you? What kind of psychological therapy, what sort of medicine, what sort of employment support, what sort of educational assistance works for you? So, I think this is what the technology world actually offers. It actually is personalized. I mean, what we all know about the digital world and what's so different to healthcare, you play with your own phone, you play with your own bank account, your own travel account, your own Instagram. You're playing with your own world. You are an active voice in that thing. You're creating the content in that thing. When you go to a healthcare clinic, you sit there and wait to be asked. And then you give us responses only to the questions you're asked. And you only get what that shop's cooking,
Yeah.
Sorry, we do cognitive therapy. Sorry, we prescribe medicines. Sorry, we do alcohol abstinence. Sorry, we only do employment support. You only get what they do. And depending on how many different shops you go to, whether you can be bothered, or whether they're even close, whether you can even get there, whether you can even travel there, whether they're even there. So in a lot of rural Australia, regional Australia, there is only one shop, if you're lucky, a doctor's family practice or a one non-government agency, and that's all there is. I mean, forget choice. You've got to be grateful for the bit that's on offer. The internet world offers the world of those things. You could potentially be getting help from North America or Canada or South America or somewhere else, from Australia. You could be getting help from anywhere. You don't have to get it from the locals. You may not like the locals. The locals tend to be very good people, but there's a limit to what they can do, okay?
Yeah.
There's a world of expertise out there that might actually understand your problem a good deal better than whatever professionals opened a shop down the road from you.
When you speak it like this, it really does fill me with optimism. And I really appreciate your time. It's been phenomenal. And just to end, I'd love to ask how you see this digital platform, digital mental health service developing. And I'd love just to kind of know your mental health utopia for the next, say, 15, 20 years.
Well, I think in a really good way, digital mental health, the optimistic view, okay? The Irish view here is the optimistic view, is that the intrinsic power of technology will be taken up by good people and will be very effectively deployed, okay? And I must say, I've seen examples of this of young, one should be optimistic about the young, one should be rather reserved about the elderly, I think young people will take up the tools that they've grown up with and use them very productively. And I see this in really disadvantaged countries in South America and in Africa, and to a degree in India. Young people picking up the tools and go, you know what? I know what to do with this. This tool is so powerful. I can use this in the way that my community, that people actually need. And it will support connections. It will support healthcare. It's very, in a sense, democratic. It's very independent. It's not very easily controlled by governments and power elites. It actually is very disruptive to a lot of the traditional things that have oppressed people or excluded people from healthcare or from thriving socially. So the optimistic view is that technology will be the most fabulous enabler in mental health. In fact, in that sense, I think technology is by far the best thing that's happened ever in my lifetime in mental health, because it will bottom up actually provide capability in a way that top-down systems, I hate, if it's not already clear, top-down NHS-style systems where people plan the world for you. The great old
Mm.
Stalinists, we plan for you one big health system, and guess what? It doesn't meet your needs. It doesn't meet your needs in the UK or Australia or Canada or anywhere else. And it doesn't work. It never worked for mental health, and it never will. You can't plan for everybody. You can't say that, and you all just get the average rather than what you need or the best we can do. These are bottom up and disruptive. So the optimistic view, I think, is that technology will transform and deliver very quickly, as it has disrupted many, many other industries in this area, because it'll be a tool in the hands of young people, and it is not constrained by national boundaries and others. Governments can't really stop it.
Yeah.
Now so the optimistic view is that will be very good. The slightly more pessimistic view, the Northern English view, the slightly more, it's another rainy day view, is, be a bit dour about it, a bit Yorkshire about it. I don't know that this will go well, And a slightly European view, we better regulate the hell out of it to stop it going badly. We better tie it up in regulation because it's so threatening, is that there's a Wild West element to it, and that it could, go badly. And that, in a sense, the behavior of the large American tech companies, has generally been, don't regulate us, let we do what we like, minimal respect for privacy and other sets of issues, that it could go wrong, and that will lead to a backlash in kind of things. I think the truth is we're trying to find the balance of these things at the moment. So my view is a fundamentally optimistic one, because I think that's my natural disposition, which I attribute to the part of the Irish family that decided to get on a boat and move to a sunnier climate. Well, actually, like many of the Irish, it was poverty that forced them to go, actually.
Yes.
But the idea that it must be better somewhere else, there must be more opportunity. No point sitting here whinging about it. Better go do something about it. So I think my view is an optimistic one, but at another level, I think we all need to be active participants in that dialogue. At another level, I'm a bit more pragmatic about that. It won't necessarily go well just by watching it. I think we need to be engaged. All of us need to be engaged about, can we find the best ways? And I must say, in another way, the most equitable ways that these things get to the world that most needs them. They're not just simply owned and controlled by those who are already most privileged.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much for this conversation. I think so many people will deeply appreciate it, because we said before that unfortunately the idea of a collective well-being is a little countercultural, but I think people will really appreciate this, and you'll force people, or maybe encourage people to question whether or not was it face-to-face connection, or was it just connection, and is my family member someone that I can rely on, or is it really my friend or my friend's brother? Honestly, thanks a million for this, Ian. I really appreciate it.
Your community. I think that's one of the things, Jim, people really, really should dwell on. What is the really strong intrinsic value of the community in which I live? Just to give you a final example, during the COVID period, I was largely out of Sydney in this beach community in which I otherwise spend my sort of other life. And, interestingly, all the people in that community are not necessarily family, right? Because they all come from everywhere else. But actually, they spent quite a long time all coming to understand that they're part of the same physical place, a really beautiful part of the country physically, but also working on the connection within that, with each other, by choice, by active choice, not by obligation, not by inherited responsibility, but by choice in the particular area. And from a mental health point of view, they are some of the strongest kind of elements that underpin our collective well-being. In a term, I've been very rude about the English, so I'm going to say something nice about the English to finish, where in 2008, they really popularised the idea of the mental wealth, not the mental health, but the mental wealth of a nation, out of a series of the Office of UK Science. And the mental wealth of a nation is a composite of the mental wealth of smaller communities. Okay, so you want to see in economic terms, or the mental health and well-being. It is, does the small world networks that we are part of. We're not really part of a global network. We're part of small world networks, not limited anymore by just where we are, enhanced by connection. Do they function? And within that diversity we talked about is fine to be sensitive, it's fine to be well, but to know that it's functioning, and when it's functioning well, the chances that we are well are much increased, And at times when we're not doing so well ourselves, we need those communities, and we need to contribute to those communities for our own well-being and for the well-being of others.
Totally. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Thanks so much. I really appreciate you giving us your time. I think this podcast will be very important for a lot of people. And I hope you continue to do the great work you're doing and work on that beautiful tan.
Yes. Unfortunately, those of us with Celtic skin shouldn't get too much sun.
No, you're right. I was in Sydney for 6 months, and about 25 minutes of sun per day was good for me, because otherwise it got dangerously close to red over brown.
Yeah.
But thanks so much, Ian. I really appreciate it, and best of luck in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim. Send me the link.